Black and wearing a business suit? What is this, lawyer cosplay, sweetheart? He sneered, then pulled the trigger in broad daylight. A black woman collapsed on the sidewalk, unarmed, not resisting. But what he didn't know, the victim was a federal prosecutor who had indicted 3 governors and 2 police chiefs. She didn't die, but his career did. The video spread across the internet like fire meeting gasoline. The entire nation demanded answers. Who gave a cop the idea he could pull the trigger and grab lunch like nothing happened? Is justice still alive where you live? What state are you in? A black woman driving a federal vehicle? Must be a thief, the officer shouted, his right hand already clenched around the grip of his gun. He stood in the middle of a crowded street, sunlight slanting through the windshield of the sleek black SUV he had just blocked. Government plates, tinted windows, silence. No one inside stepped out immediately. But the way the vehicle had stopped, the way the engine shut off cleanly, it wasn't the behavior of someone panicked or trying to flee. He didn't care. To Cole Merrick, the only thing that mattered in that moment was a truth born from bias. A black woman driving a federal-plated SUV in the heart of the administrative district had to be abnormal. And abnormal, in his mind, meant dangerous. The door opened. No music, no shouting. The woman stepped out, one step at a time, slow, deliberate, as if counting each tile beneath her heels. She wore a black button-up shirt, collar fastened up, not a single inch of skin visible except her hands. Oversized sunglasses covered half her face. Her hands didn't tremble, didn't reach for a bag, didn't wave. Just one hand extended straight toward Cole, and in the palm a federal ID card, clean, wordless. Cole glanced at it, then sneered. It wasn't amusement. It was contempt. He snatched the card, glanced at it briefly, then flung it to the ground. The throw wasn't forceful, but it was precise. The ID landed right in a puddle by the curb, splashing a dirty drop onto her shoe. A black woman driving a federal vehicle? Must be a thief, he repeated, louder this time, as if he wanted the whole street to hear. People stopped. A woman pushing a stroller turned around. A high schooler raised his phone, unblinking. But the woman, she didn't move. Her arm slowly lowered. The sunglasses stayed on. She bent down, picked up the ID, and wiped it once with her sleeve, then stood tall, facing the barrel of the gun that was now slowly lifting. "I am unarmed," she said, her voice low, clear, not defiant, just a statement. "All I have is breath." A light breeze swept past. Enough to ruffle the hem of her shirt, but also enough to reveal that her shoulders didn't shake. Cole, he stood still, but his finger was already curled around the trigger. No warning, no request for backup, no background check. Just a decision. Brief, cold, irreversible. The gunshot tore through the air like a rip in fabric. The bullet traveled less than 6 feet, slamming into the woman's left shoulder. Blood burst sideways, streaking across the SUV's side mirror, leaving a thick, dark trail. She didn't scream. She dropped to one knee. One hand clutched her chest, the other braced against the car door. The ID card slipped from her hand again, this time with no sound. A child in the car behind them screamed, sobbing uncontrollably, unclear if from fear or shock. The woman with the stroller stepped back, then shouted, "You shot her? You just shot her?" But Cole said nothing. He just stood there, eyes vacant. No remorse, no concern, as if pulling the trigger was just another routine gesture, like honking a horn. The student's phone kept recording. From a slightly angled view, the image was clear. A black woman, unarmed, presenting a federal ID, shot in broad daylight in the middle of the street. The frame caught the sunlight glinting off her sunglasses. A brief sparkle, then gone. Viewers wouldn't hear her scream, wouldn't see her resist, only her silent collapse, like a tree felled without fanfare. The blood continued to seep, spreading across the sidewalk. Someone called for an ambulance. Brakes screeched at the intersection, sirens blared. But for some, the truth had been clear the moment the bullet left the barrel, not because they knew who she was, but because they saw clearly that she had done nothing. Cole reached for his radio. "Suspicious, non-compliant subject. Neutralized," he recited it. Like muscle memory, conditioned reflex, no fact-checking, no validation. None of the witnesses had seen her resist, but the words had been spoken and a report was already forming. All that remained was paperwork, to turn a bullet into protocol. Jordan hadn't fully fallen. She kept one elbow on the car edge, fighting to breathe. Short, jagged breaths, but still breathing. She said nothing more. Her head hung slightly. Her sunglasses stayed on. No one could see her eyes, but those standing closest, if observant enough, would notice her hand still in that same posture, not waving, not pleading, not angry. An ambulance siren wailed in the distance. The student stopped recording, eyes still locked forward. The child in the back seat hadn't stopped crying. And Cole, he stepped back twice, eyeing the body before him like inspecting the results of a shot. He inhaled deeply, turned away, and said, "Done." But he didn't know the camera was still rolling. More than that, he didn't know the woman he had just shot wasn't some nameless shadow. She had a name. She had a record. She carried a federal ID. And now, that card lay on the pavement beside a smear of blood, straight and cold, like an indictment. The blood was still warm when the nurse's hand slipped beneath the blood-soaked black shirt. Not to save, but to confirm. That black woman, the one who had collapsed in the middle of the street in a scene so familiar most wouldn't bother to care, wasn't carrying a weapon, no knife, no gun, no threat of any kind, but she did carry something most men with guns never dared to face head-on, a federal identification card bearing the unmistakable imprint, Department of Justice. The badge lay askew beneath the soaked fabric, part of it pressed against the skin beneath her clavicle, slightly bent from the impact of the bullet. "I'm sorry, a federal prosecutor." "Huh?" she whispered, breath stuttering, each word like it was being pried from a throat parched with pain and blood. She didn't shout her title to be saved. She spoke of it as a fact, a message, a warning, or perhaps an indictment against the very system that let her collapse without any justification except the color of her skin. The emergency room tightened like a steel cable. The trauma doctor, seasoned in handling gunshot wounds, froze for a moment upon examining the bullet path. The shot had pierced the soft tissue of her left shoulder, missing the carotid artery by less than a centimeter. "Just a little closer," he muttered, not needing to finish the sentence. The others in the room understood without being told. Death had brushed by, left a bleeding hello, and silently turned away. The DOJ badge was carefully placed on a stainless steel tray. It was still stained with blood, but clear enough to read the name, title, and etched signature. A young nurse glanced at it, lips pressed tight. No one said a word. Not because they had nothing to say, but because every word felt hollow next to a brutal truth. She was a federal prosecutor, and she had just been shot in the street like a stray dog. A hospital police officer arrived to check the situation. He was young, not even 30, and still unaccustomed to seeing human blood not from a car accident. He spotted the badge, then looked at the pale face of the woman being bandaged on the table. Her eyes were nearly closed, brows furrowed in pain. He frowned, pulled out his phone, typed the name on the badge, and within seconds, headlines flooded his screen. Federal prosecutor leads DOJ investigation into police corruption scheme. Jordan Hale, fearless face of anti-abuse task force. He swallowed hard, his face drained of color. His hand trembled as he shut the screen, then turned away. Outside, Cole Merrick remained surrounded by local press, his expression blank. He stood with arms crossed, breathing softly, as if he had just completed a routine traffic stop. Someone asked, "Are you sure she was a threat?" He stared straight into the lens, pressed his lips, then smirked. "I've handled plenty of these situations," he replied, slowly, like lecturing a room of clueless law students. His tone held no defensiveness, not a trace of fear or regret, just the voice of someone convinced he stood in the right place, playing the right role, in a system that allowed him to pull a trigger simply because he didn't like how a woman stepped out of a vehicle without lowering her head. The live stream, captured by the student, had already begun spreading at a terrifying pace. In less than 2 hours, the clip had surpassed 2 million million views. Every share was like another slash at the mask law enforcement had long worn, that fabricated mask claiming they always follow protocol. But this time, what was the protocol? Aiming a gun at an unarmed person? Firing at someone presenting an ID? Spilling blood in the street under the silent gaze of passers-by? In the emergency room, Jordan was moved into close monitoring. She wasn't fully conscious yet, but her vitals had stabilized. The doctor made a note. Female patient, approximately 35 years old, gunshot wound through left shoulder, no damage to major artery, low risk of shock, neurological monitoring of the neck area recommended due to trauma response and acute blood loss. The clean lines of text didn't reflect the emotion of the one writing. They were just a fraction of the bureaucratic file to be sent to the DOJ, where, ironically, she had once reviewed similar reports. In an office not far away, a senior DOJ aide received an urgent message. He opened his computer. The name Jordan Hale lit up on the screen, along with a personal photo and internal access code. But what froze him was the attached video, the trajectory, the words, and the look in Cole's eyes, all captured unmistakably. He didn't speak. He just placed his hands on the keyboard, but before typing a single word, he paused, as if asking himself, this time, what will I write? A report, a summons, or an indictment of the very system she once trusted to protect? On the street, people began to gather, not protesting, not marching, just standing, silent, looking toward the spot where a woman had been shot in broad daylight. Her blood had been wiped from the car, but the red smear on the side mirror remained. No one dared to touch it. No one wanted to erase such a vivid piece of evidence. Cole returned to his office, hung up his hat and poured a cup of coffee. No one greeted him. No one checked in. But no one questioned him either. He sat down, opened his computer. On the desk was the preliminary report. Shooting incident due to perceived threat from unidentified subject. He squinted at the line, then typed a single sentence into the comment box. I acted on instinct and responded promptly. He hit send, as if submitting an online purchase. Jordan hadn't opened her eyes yet, but her breathing had settled. Her heart rate on the monitor was steady. A nurse gently adjusted the thin blanket draped over her. The DOJ badge, now cleaned of blood, sat beside the bed, on a small metal table. The light from the overhead lamp caught the surface, reflecting a cold glint, sharp, almost blade-like. In that moment, no one said it aloud, but everyone knew. The badge was no longer a symbol of duty. It had become evident, and the name engraved on it, Jordan Hale, would no longer lie dormant in a file. The cold white light reflected off the metal surface of the DOJ badge like a blade slicing through the painted overlay. Someone once tried to pass as truth. The name Jordan Hale was no longer just printed text on a thick plastic card. It had become a slap in the face of the very system she had once worked for, defended, and believed in. But her collapse didn't mark the end of anything. On the contrary, the silence after the shot was just a fuse waiting to be lit. And this time, the fire didn't rise from the fury of the streets, but from the very places meant to preserve calm. Press rooms, television studios, and the 8 o'clock news. A new clip surfaced online. It wasn't from the original live stream, nor from traffic cameras, which police had previously claimed were malfunctioning. This was from a residential security camera, old but clear, angled from a second-floor balcony across the street. The perspective was higher, wider, and uncut. In the footage, Jordan could be seen stepping out of her vehicle, sunglasses still on, extending her badge with one hand. Cole didn't question her, didn't verify. He snatched the badge from her hand, a motion so aggressive it was nearly a slap, and less than 3 seconds later the bullet was fired, at close range, with no warning, no sign of threat. The clip ended with a white woman screaming from the sidewalk, but the sound that echoed longest was not her scream. It was the sound of the act itself and the total absence of justification. A forensic medical expert was invited to speak live on CNN that night. She had advised 3 different attorneys general. When asked about Officer Cole Merrick's conduct, She didn't need more than a minute to answer. The victim's posture, the distance, the timing of the weapon draw, none of it aligns with defensive protocol. This was an immediate execution. There is no medical or tactical reason to justify that shot. And the most dangerous part, he knew that. On Twitter, the name Jordan Hale began resurfacing. A string of old articles reemerged like scabs ripped open. Female prosecutor led internal probe into abuse ring within Queens Police Department. Jordan Hale, the woman who took on 3 police departments in 4 years. Federal prosecutor Jordan Hale, the uncompromising face of structural justice. These headlines, once buried beneath waves of celebrity gossip, were now shared millions of times, each share a heartbeat of collective outrage. And this time, the public wasn't just watching, they were demanding answers. Inside a closed Facebook group for law enforcement personnel, a post was screenshotted and leaked. Its title was clear: "Good. Teach those blacks a lesson." Below it was a still frame of Cole firing at Jordan, paused at the exact moment the bullet left the barrel. The image was accompanied by dozens of likes and laugh reactions from accounts using nicknames, but some with visible details like unit patches, police academy logos, and in some cases, full, real names beneath their profile picture. The local police department's communications office couldn't react fast enough. The initial statement about non-compliant behavior from an unidentified suspect was silently removed. News networks began shifting tone. Suspect now confirmed to be a federal prosecutor. Injury is serious but not life-threatening. But the phrase, "shot while presenting federal ID," had already spread too deeply to pull back. It wasn't just news anymore. It was an event, undeniably evidence of how this system responds to skin color, regardless of rank, authority, or truth. In an emergency meeting, the city's police chief, Earl D. Langford, walked in wearing an internal comms mic. He didn't know the audio system was already connected to a trial recording feed, and he certainly didn't know that the moment he sat down, he let slip a sentence that would cost him his position without a single press release. Why'd it have to be her? That sentence, 6 short words, tore the mask off an entire system that had always hoped to target someone anonymous, someone without a badge, without power. Why'd it have to be her? Was not a question of ethics. It was regret, panic, a form of remorse not for the shooting, but for shooting someone too inconvenient. Savvy media outlets didn't miss the opportunity. A wave of editorials followed. If someone like Jordan Hale can be shot, who gets to survive? When justice falls, who will rise? This is no longer just a shooting, this is a shot at the trust of an entire community. National broadcasts interrupted their primetime lineup for a live panel discussion, inviting experts, former prosecutors, social activists, and Black community representatives to the table. One speaker declared on air, "We used to think a title kept you safe, but Jordan is living proof. Sometimes, not even legal authority can shield you from the gaze of a man with a gun and a heart full of contempt." The Department of Justice remained silent, but an anonymous source revealed Cole Merrick's entire personnel file had been placed under emergency review. Questions started surfacing fast. Who approved his hiring? How many complaints had he received? Why had he never been internally disciplined? And more importantly, who had been protecting him all this time? Local officials dodged the questions, but social media did not. A clipped interview from 5 years prior resurfaced, showing Jordan responding to a question about investigating misconduct in police departments. "I'm not looking for culprits, I'm looking for patterns. And if that pattern is foundational to the system, then the system itself must be investigated." The video lasted just 23 seconds, but it became the defining quote of a nationwide backlash campaign. A new hashtag was born, "Not Just a Shot." And in every tweet, every post, every image shared, the truth began to slice through like a surgical light on an exposed wound. This was no longer just a shooting. This was exposure. If a single bullet was enough to shake public opinion, then the true identity of the person shot became the detonator of a political earthquake. The viral video wasn't just proof of a boundary crossed, it was the opening image of a full-scabble retreat, because the name Jordan Hale after 3 days of silence, was no longer that of a federal prosecutor who happened to be in the wrong place. She was a symbol the system once feared, and now was being forced to confront. On the morning of the 4th day after the shooting, the FBI officially took over all case files, the crime scene, data, and the investigative process from the local police department. The decision was signed by the deputy director of the Bureau's Internal Affairs Division, with no press release, no conference, just a cold government-stamped memo, delivered to the police chief's office at 6:42 EMU-IM. 30 minutes later, all physical and digital files related to the Cole Merrick Jordan Hale incident were locked from local access. Every security camera, storage server, and internal radio recording was backed up, encrypted, and transferred to federal headquarters in D.C. via secure channel. No explanation, no exceptions, no objections, just a silence as heavy as a sealed warrant. An FBI agent stepped out from the surgery ward where Jordan was still being treated, turned to the waiting reporters outside, and said slowly, without expression, "She's alive because the bullet missed, not because Cole held back." His voice didn't rise, didn't inflect, but it was so clear it silenced the entire hallway. No one questioned it. That sentence answered everything. At the same time, a series of images resurfaced from the Department of Justice's internal archives. Jordan Hale standing before Congress, holding a report over 200 pages thick, the title printed in bold, "Accountability in Law Enforcement." In another photo, she wore a DOJ uniform, receiving the Distinguished Service Medal from the Attorney General. Calm face, sharp gaze, chin raised. A photo once buried among pandemic-era press releases now spreads across the internet like a reminder. Not everyone falls quietly. Leading news outlets ran bold headlines simultaneously. Jordan Hale, the woman who dared investigate the country's most powerful police departments, shot by the very thing she fought. But this time, instead of apologies, the system responded with confusion. Officials who once dismissed her recommendations were now being named publicly. Old quotes were pulled. Every period and every report was dissected. By mid-afternoon, an anonymous hacker collective released a string of documents extracted from a private forum called Bloodline Front, a gathering place for former officers, military veterans, and far-right militias. The data included real names, posts, activity logs, and a thread of exchanges among users. One name stood out, C. Merrick 45, with comments like, "One day the law will belong to the men brave enough to defend the country," and "Black women think they have power? Try driving a government car." The online community immediately traced and confirmed that C. Merrick 45 matched Cole Merrick's birth date, city, and email previously tied to his official records. No one was surprised. But this time, there was no denying. No more unverified, no more suspected. Everything was as clear as the blood once sprayed across the side mirror. In a high-rise office building in downtown D.C., DOJ legal advisors gathered for an emergency meeting. Projected on the screen were 3 lines. 1. Jordan Hale, medical status. 2. Cole Merrick, service record. 3. State-level liability. No one in the room made eye contact. They stared only at the data, because at this point it was no longer about a bullet or a rogue officer. This was a stress test for the entire system, triggered by someone it had once ignored, and now was being forced to remember in blood. And while powerful forces moved like chess pieces across a burning board, the woman beneath the white blanket had yet to speak. No press conference, no tweets, no statements, not a single post. Jordan's silence was the loudest voice in the room, and it pushed every layer of power into retreat. People weren't waiting for her words to feel compassion. They feared the day she finally spoke, because on that day, every remaining mask would fall. Cole was being held in a special isolation unit. No phone access, no attorney visits, but he was still smiling. Not the smug grin from day one, but the detached smirk of a man who no longer saw anything as significant. When a federal agent asked him about the far-right forum, he merely shrugged. "Everyone needs a place to vent, that was mine," then closed his eyes, as if exhausted from having to explain what he considered self-evident. But the system was no longer naive enough to think silence was harmless. Every email he ever sent, every chat log, every transfer form, every forgotten report, every blurred signature, all were being unearthed. And at the eye of that storm stood the name Jordan Hale, no longer a victim. She had become the epicenter of a fracture that could never be sealed. She did not speak. While news outlets raced for milliseconds to update every new camera angle, while analysts squeezed every frame to decode every glance, while both mainstream media and independent platforms launched into a frenzy to capture even one confirming word, Jordan Hale remained still. She posted nothing. She did not leave her hospital room. She gave no statements. She did not meet the press. She didn't sigh before any camera, and it was that silence that began to terrify the entire system. Because no voice carries farther than the silence of someone who knows exactly what they are up against. At precisely 11:04 a.m. on Friday, 4 days after the shooting, Jordan Hale's account on X, formerly Twitter, lit up. Just one line. No hashtags, no links, no image, no subtext. I don't need to scream. I just need to outlive the lie. 9 words. 10 seconds of typing. A single slice across the throat of a decades-old web of deception. The sentence didn't call for protest, didn't beg for justice, didn't posture as a victim. It simply existed, like a blade planted in the middle of political news feeds and emergency briefings, a declaration spoken softly, but sharp enough to force those who thought she had been silenced to hold their breath. In just 3 hours, the tweet surpassed 12 million interactions. But they weren't idle likes. A surge of reposts came from accounts tied to prosecutors, federal attorneys, internal investigators, most anonymous, faceless. A post by a group called Silent DOJ spread rapidly. She once told us, if you want to change the system, don't yell. Survive long enough to expose it through endurance. Today, she's done exactly that. They didn't name her. They didn't need to, because in the legal world, colleagues recognize the cadence of solidarity better than the voice of any spokesperson. Support didn't come from the media. It came from those who held the law in their hands and were now asking themselves, if a senior federal prosecutor could be shot and the system couldn't respond in time, who truly controls justice? That night, the Department of Justice convened an emergency meeting. No cameras, no press, no journalists. But the list of attendees leaked just 6 minutes after the email summons went out. The Deputy Attorney General, 2 Assistant AGs, the Director of Internal Oversight, and a congressional liaison. One person in the room, later quoted in an internal investigation, said a single sentence before the meeting began. We're not facing misconduct. We're facing a bankruptcy of trust. No one objected, and no one dared speak louder after that. Jordan still said nothing, but voices on her behalf began emerging in places no one expected. A law professor at Harvard wrote on a private blog, "She chose not to speak, so we would be forced to. Her silence is the clearest mirror of what we've grown used to ignoring." A political commentary podcast in Atlanta aired a special episode titled, "Why Didn't She Scream?" And a human rights activist who had once criticized Jordan over a case 3 years ago publicly apologized. "I didn't understand, because I've never had a gun pointed at me for showing a badge." Inside the hospital, Room 412 was placed under maximum security. No one entered without federal clearance. And, though unseen, it was rumored that Jordan kept her phone nearby, ringer off, ignoring all messages, even from those who had stood beside her in the most complex cases. Not because she cut ties, but because she knew, at this moment, every word was gasoline. And sometimes silence is what most disorients those used to scripting the narrative. That night, on a televised talk show, a media analyst was invited to dissect the tweet. He spoke, equal parts bewildered and shaken. She didn't assign blame, didn't cry out, didn't highlight pain. She simply affirmed her existence. And that makes every defense meaningless. And that was what started to unnerve the system. Because until now, they had only ever known 2 kinds of responses: rage or retreat. But Jordan chose neither. She did not run, nor did she fight conventionally. She simply existed, visibly, unapologetically, like a silent shadow amid the blinding lights of media spectacle, forcing everyone to re-examine what they once took as truth. That silence wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a first strike, a challenge, a reckoning that required no courtroom, and its cost was that the entire system began to lose its footing right within the halls of its power. When silence becomes fire, the first thing it burns away isn't words. It's the thin layer of plaster hiding the truth. And in the days that followed, brick by brick, the seemingly solid wall around Cole Merrick began to crumble, not because someone tore it down, but because it was never built on truth to begin with. The first revelation came from an anonymous Substack account. No profile picture, no bio, just a single name. Inside the Blue. The post opened with one line: "Everyone's talking about the bullet. Let's talk about the 6 others that flew and were forgotten." Attached was a list of 7 complaints filed against Cole Merrick over the past 3 years, complete with dates, accusers' names, incident report numbers, and in some cases even photos of injury. 6 of the 7 had been dismissed as insufficient grounds for further investigation. 1 had been closed due to unidentified complainant. Within 2 hours, a reputable news outlet verified the entire data set. The confirmation came not just from internal records, but from the very people who had suffered and gone unheard. One of them, a middle-aged black man with salt and pepper hair named Malcolm Traynor, appeared on camera for a local TV station. No suit, no badge, just a worn sweater and eyes locked on the lens. Voice steady. 3 years ago, he slammed me face first onto the pavement. I raised my hand, and he pinned my neck with his knee without asking a single question. I thought I'd never see daylight again. But yesterday, I saw that woman still breathing. Now I believe justice isn't dead yet. That statement, unscripted, unrehearsed, was quickly clipped, subtitled, and shared across social media as living proof that Cole Merrick wasn't a crack in the system, but a loose thread in an unraveling fabric. And once one truth is verified, it clears the way for others. More bricks, damp and decayed, just waiting to fall. An investigative journalist from Capital Sentinel released a 30-page exposé titled "Not an Individual, a Pattern." The piece laid bare the connections between Cole and Sergeant Dana Wickley, who served as head of behavioral review for nearly 7 years. She had overseen internal misconduct reports, and unsurprisingly, 6 of the 7 complaints against Cole had passed through her hands. They'd appeared together at multiple training sessions, signed off on each other's paperwork, and worked at the same precinct. Most notably, she was the one who finalized the report, stating, "Officer Merrick acted within protocol. No evidence of misconduct." A human rights watchdog immediately filed a Freedom of Information request to obtain Sergeant Wickley's service file for the past 10 years. The results? Over 100 rejected complaints, more than 50 unresolved disciplinary reports, and over 30 officers, including Cole, retained despite clear signs of wrongdoing. During an evening newscast, a retired chief inspector remarked, "We've got one man pulling the trigger, but we've got dozens who put the gun in his hand." That statement didn't stop in the studio. It echoed into every police department conference room, every interagency meeting, and every internal email thread. And everywhere it landed, the response was the same: silence. No one stepped forward to take responsibility, no apologies. No one emerged from that shadow. Only files, reports, and cold signatures, now being dragged into the light page by page. By now, people were no longer seeing Cole as just an individual, but as a symptom of a structure. A cracked brick doesn't fracture on its own. It fractures because the foundation is already rotten. And with every new testimony, every leaked email, every witness emerging, another brick fell loose. An old audio recording, never before released, was leaked on Reddit, capturing a conversation between Cole and a rookie officer. After he returned from a shift, that had generated a complaint. Cole's voice was clear, unhesitant. You think justice is something noble? It's paper, and if someone big enough holds the pen, no case ever makes it. The clip lasted less than a minute, but every word, every sentence cut through the thin camouflage law enforcement had been desperately trying to reapply. There was no room left for denial. This was no outlier. This was a chain, a process, a model. And the wall, now, wasn't falling from a punch. It was collapsing on its own. Brick by brick, layer by layer, mortar never truly set. The wall never collapses from the center. It cracks from the edges. And sometimes, the most important brick doesn't come from a powerful hand, but from someone society doesn't bother to name. Morris knew that. He knew it better than anyone, because for 18 years he had lived under the same awning, on the same street corner, with the same thin blanket and with an old phone that had no SIM card, no contacts, but a still functioning key. And on that fateful afternoon when no one else was watching, he saw. When no one else believed, he recorded. People called him that loony with the damn camera. The doorman once chased him off with a broom. The cafe owner across the street once pulled back her donation after seeing him talk to a stray cat. But when he walked into the newsroom of the Capitol Sentinel, with his tangled beard and ash-colored eyes, carrying a USB stick held together with faded masking tape, the room fell silent. Because the video inside needed no editing. It was raw truth. No voiceover, no effects, no narration. The footage tilted from the rusted awning of an abandoned apartment, capturing the diagonal view where the SUV stopped. No cuts, no shadows, just unfiltered footage. Jordan stepped out, held out her badge. Cole snatched it. And then a chilling voice rang out. "Black on the street is guilty." That voice wasn't Morris's. It wasn't a bystander's. It came from the mic pinned to Cole's collar. The footage caught his lip movement, perfectly synced with the decrypted audio from the department's internal system. The video's GPS timestamp matched the city's satellite system. Every element aligned, from the shadow cast by a street lamp to the faint sound of a distant horn. And by the third replay, no analyst was needed. This was no longer a question. This was evidence. In a closed-door press briefing, an investigative editor asked Morris, "Are you sure you saw it with your own eyes?" Morris lifted his gaze from a paper cup of tea and replied, quietly but clearly, "No one believed me." But she stopped and showed her ID. "I saw it all. I saw she did nothing, and I saw that he didn't need a reason to pull the trigger. He didn't cry, didn't get angry, didn't ask for anything. He simply placed both hands on his bony knees and said, 'I held onto that clip for 4 days, because I wanted to be sure that this time they'd have to look straight at it, no turning away.'" No one replied to him. But by evening, the video was leading every national news broadcast. The image of a frail homeless man sitting beneath a rusted awning, his hands trembling as he handed a USB to a reporter, became an unforeseen symbol, a witness from the lowest place, bearing the highest proof. On X, a federal attorney wrote, "If justice still exists, it was just awakened, not by a judge, but by a man with no home, yet a memory that couldn't be erased." The hashtag Morris Testimony spread rapidly, and overnight, thousands left messages. "I see you. I believe you. You're no longer invisible." One standout comment was pinned by the Capitol Sentinel itself, "Thank you for seeing. Because if no one sees, no one survives." At an internal FBI meeting, the clip played on a large screen. No one spoke for the full 2 minutes and 19 seconds. When the screen went black, the lead agent asked one question. What did we do for 4 days that a homeless man captured from a rusted awning? No one had an answer. In the hospital room, when the video played on the small monitor beside the bed, Jordan watched without blinking. When the phrase, "Black on the street is guilty," was heard, she didn't flinch, didn't look away. She just lowered her sunglasses slightly, and the gaze from her real eyes burned through the screen like molten steel. No one knew what she was thinking. But the nearby nurse later said her left hand, the one that had held out the badge, tightened. The next morning, a group of civil rights attorneys issued a joint statement. "Thank you, Mr. Morris. Without you, we would still be debating what is already beyond question." Immediately after, they filed a petition to extract the full 6-month body cam archive of Cole. If a homeless man could provide a clip that shattered every excuse, then there was no justification for the system to keep hiding what should have always been transparent. Morris didn't become a star. He declined every interview afterward. When asked if he needed anything, he simply said, "Don't make me prove I'm worth trusting ever again." And just like that, the man the city had ignored became the only one who made the whole machine pause. Just as Morris stepped out of the light, another name was forced into the center: Dana Wickley. The woman once hailed as the professional midwife of an entire generation of police officers, featured in tactical training modules under the title Gold Standard in High-Pressure Response, was now the next exposed link dragged out of the shadows. But unlike Morris, she didn't bring evidence to save anyone. She brought the corrosion she had smeared across the wall of justice, claiming it was mortar. The first revelation came during a closed-door hearing. A young officer, not yet 30, named Jared Klein, who had served under Wickley at the South 14th Precinct, took the stand in the suffocating silence of the panel. Sweat traced the collar of his crisp new uniform, but his voice did not tremble. "Last April, I wrote an honest report about a wrongful arrest in the park. The victim had scrapes. There were witnesses. I submitted the draft to Sergeant Wickley. She read it once and said, if I didn't fudge the details, I could forget about ever getting promoted." That sentence landed like a slap across the face of an internal affairs system that had long marketed itself as independent, objective, transparent, and before anyone could refute it, a flood of old case files surfaced, each one closed with Dana Wickley's signature, ending misconduct claims. An investigative reporter from Capital Sentinel uncovered 3 internal emails in which Wickley issued direct orders to delete body cam footage due to technical errors compromising evidentiary quality. One of those emails matched the date of a complaint that had sparked 4 days of public protest, only to be officially ruled lacking significant misconduct. The complainant from that case, upon hearing the news about Wickley, posted a single sentence on her social media: I was silenced. By the end of that day, the Federal Department of Justice issued an emergency summons for Dana Wickley under 3 preliminary charges: obstruction of internal investigative protocol, destruction of federal evidence, and collusion in systemic misconduct cover-ups. The order was signed at 9:03 p.m., transferred to the FBI at 9:07 p.m., and executed at precisely 12:14 a.m., just 4 minutes after agents entered the gated residence where Wickley lived alone. She did not struggle, did not resist, but the look in her eyes when the cuffs clicked wasn't surprise. It was the gaze of someone who knew the ending had already been written and was merely waiting for the page to turn. As she was escorted through the corridor of the federal office, a reporter shouted, "Do you have anything to say about the Cole Merrick case?" Wickley stopped, looked straight into the lens, and gave a smile so cold it bordered on haunting. "I didn't shoot her. I just did my job. This world doesn't run on justice. It runs on who covers for whom." That statement, cynical, pragmatic, brutal, was not edited out of the news segment. On the contrary, it aired verbatim, bold subtitles and all, and became the most quoted sentence over the next 24 hours, because for the first time, someone inside the system said aloud what everyone knew, but no one had dared to write down. Justice isn't protected by law, it is distorted by silent consent, and the one who had long upheld that silence was now being abandoned by those who once benefited from it. At the same time, inside a federal holding cell, Cole Merrick began to feel the ground shift beneath him. He had lost his attorney, he had lost access to his case files, and now he had lost the most ironclad shield he ever had, Dana Wickley. One message was found on his phone, sent at 12:06 a.m. EM, just 8 minutes before Wickley's arrest. "I need you. I need you now more than ever. Don't let me fall." There was no reply. 20 minutes later, he sent another. "They're getting close. You know how to handle this. Do it. I know you've got someone inside." 3 hours later, forensic agents recovered a response from Wickley's number, time-stamped 1:47 a.m. This time, "I'm not dying for an idiot." That message wasn't long, but it carried the essence of an entire system once powered by covert protection. When the facade cracks, those who once dined at the same table turned faster than any bullet ever chambered. Cole didn't sleep that night. He punched the wall twice, screamed at the surveillance camera, "You've killed me!" No one answered, and while the public still reeled from Morris's steel-willed testimony, the betrayal between Cole and Wickley opened an even deeper wound. Truth isn't warped by evil, but by those who know what's right and choose to bury it for gain. Wickley's final message to Cole, "This time I'm not dying for an idiot," was still echoing through the late-night news cycle when the lights came on at the National Law Enforcement Federation Conference Hall. This wasn't an annual event. It was the periodic gathering where top names in the legal world wore suits, patted each other on the back, shook hands with formal precision, and delivered speeches edited down to every period to avoid stepping into moral gray zones. But this time, no one dared predict anything, because this time, the woman the system once praised and then silently abandoned had just confirmed she would attend, not by invitation, but by promise. Jordan arrived after everyone was seated. No entourage, no spokesperson, no cameras trailing her steps. She wore a white shirt, no tie, no blazer, no medals. Her neck was still bandaged, layers of gauze pressed tightly over a wound not yet healed, like a living reminder that she had once fallen because of a system built by the very people in that room. No one clapped when she walked in, not out of disrespect, but out of fear, because there are some people who, when they return, need no courtesy. They only need presence. Jordan stood there. She didn't place her hands on the podium, didn't hold a script. No screens lit up behind her. She simply looked forward, into hundreds of eyes staring back with a blend of fear and reverence. And then she spoke. "I didn't come here to say I'm okay, because I'm not." Her voice wasn't loud, didn't carry the emphasis of a politician, but each word ricocheted off the walls like steel footsteps down a corridor of cold stone. "I came here because of a bullet, but I stand here because of everything that came before it." She paused, not for drama, but so that everyone in the room could swallow the guilt no one had dared name. "I've heard people ask, why would a federal prosecutor be shot in the street? But the real question should be, why does it take a federal prosecutor being shot for people to finally believe a bullet was unjustified?" No one moved. No one dared nod. No one dared deny. Justice isn't for protecting the reputation of police. Justice is for protecting human life. 23 words. One sentence, a slash across the face of every internal policy, every closed-door meeting, every sympathetic nod that ever passed as accountability. She ended after exactly 273 words. Not one extra, not one missing, no explanation, no rallying cry, no plea. Then she stepped down. No smile, no handshake. Yet within 10 minutes, the video of her speech had been shared across every major social media platform in the country. No media spin, no viral marketing. It was the brevity and the white bandage in a room full of armored professionals that did the work. A female law student, sitting in the last row, who had never spoken in any seminar, burst into tears. After the conference, she wrote on her page, "I was about to drop out because I thought justice was a language for the powerful. But today, I saw someone who got shot stand up and speak using only the truth. I'm staying. I want to practice law because of her." That post was reshared over 200,000 times in just 12 hours, and within 48 hours of the official video release, it reached 12 million shares, a number never before achieved by any speech in the history of the legal profession's national conferences. But the most frightening thing for the system wasn't the number of shares. It was the silence that followed. No rebuttals, no justifications, no televised panel dissected her words, no opposition dared twist her sentences, because for the first time, words didn't carry perspective, they carried blood. No one knew who pressed the button. But at 2:47 a.m., an armored FBI SUV rolled silently through sleeping streets and stopped at 3187, a two-story villa on the western edge of the city, where Cole Merrick had been temporarily housed pending internal investigation. No sirens, no warnings, no time for any calls, just 6 agents, 2 arrest warrants, an infrared surveillance grid, and a precision sharp as cold steel brushing flesh mid-dream. They didn't knock. The door was breached. The lights came on. Cold air hissed through the vents. 1 second after the first footsteps echoed in the upstairs hallway, a growl erupted from the last bedroom down the hall. "What the hell?" The sentence didn't finish. The gun was already at his forehead. No negotiations, no "let me explain," no "I'm a cop," because that night, Cole was no longer an officer. He was a suspect. His body was bare, sweat still clinging to his chest, his hand still on the phone, the last message to Wickley unanswered. As he was slammed onto the cold floor, he screamed, not from pain, but from what still echoed in his skull. Arrogance that hadn't yet died. "You're arresting me over some black bitch?" That line. No one responded, but the lead agent's mic recorded it. Word for word, clean and unfiltered. No resistance, none needed, because those who once believed they were untouchable are always weakest the moment they think they still are. Cole was dragged outside to the sound of the first thunderstorm of the season. Not nature's rage, but an uprising still unnamed, rising from the foundation of a city that had long slept on lies. At 3:00 a.m., an internal memo from the Department of Justice was released. Cole Merrick, former officer of the City Police Department, has been taken into emergency federal custody under special provisions for crimes involving racial bias where the victim is a federal justice official. At 4:19 IEM, Police Chief Earl D. Langford submitted his resignation. No press conference, no handwritten letter, no statement, just one line transferring signature authority to the Deputy Director of Administration. The only witness to him clearing his desk recalled he said nothing, just removed a framed photo of himself with Cole Merrick from the drawer, stared at it for 3 seconds, then dropped it straight into the trash. At 6:00 a.m., the Department of Justice held a press briefing. The Attorney General didn't sit in the center chair. She stood and enunciated every word without evasion. This case is no longer an isolated act. This is the final boundary between a system that protects justice and one that enables unchecked, privileged killing. We declare this will be the new standard for crimes of racial bias. No one, uniformed or not, has the right to decide who deserves to live. No words to soothe the public. No compromise lines for law enforcement. No one dodged the word bias. No mention of internal review procedure, no justifications, because that night the final brick fell, and with it the mask the system had worn for years. And this time, no one wanted to pick it up. Cole sat in the federal detention cell, sick yellow light casting shadows over bruises around his cuffed wrists. He didn't say anything anymore. No shouting, no defense, just stared blankly at the wall, eyes red, but dry, because there are no words taught to those who never imagined they'd have to say, "I was wrong." After the summoning night, the spotlight no longer shone on Cole. It fell into the witness seats. That day, the federal courtroom had no flowers, no red, white, and blue flags strung like a self-congratulatory ritual, only white light, cold, steady, unforgiving, cast down over the long wooden table where each person stepped forward, bringing not fame, but consequence. The microphone at the center of the hearing room wasn't tall, but the first voice that rose from it clinched the entire room like a throat being squeezed. She didn't state her name. She didn't need to. In the file, she was victim number 4 in a series of cases labeled internally reconciled. But in reality, she was the black woman whose arm had been broken in 2019 after being mistaken for a gang collaborator. She stood upright, pulled back her left sleeve. The arm no longer straightened. It bent unnaturally, bones set in the wrong direction, a silent statement on the kind of justice she had once received. "I don't have a camera," she said, with no quiver in her voice. "But I have the bones that broke." No one asked further, because nothing more was needed. The second was a teenager, now 18. He stepped forward in a white shirt, collar slightly wrinkled, hair trimmed short. He didn't look at Cole, seated 8 meters away, cuffed, flanked by 2 federal agents, but instead looked down at his own hands, then spoke through tears. "I used to think if I obeyed, nothing bad would happen. But when I was lying face down on the grass, both his knees were crushing my back, I believed I wouldn't live to see today. And the worst part was, when my mom begged him to stop, he just said, 'Too late, ma'am.'" That sentence wasn't emphasized by voice, but by what cracked behind it. The tears fell. Not because he was weak, but because he had never been given the chance to be weak at the right time. This was his first. The third was an old man. He couldn't walk straight. His rough wooden cane scraped the courtroom floor like the sound of time itself screeching through an open wound. He didn't speak much, just 7 sentences. The 7th was, "I outlived 3 men from my generation, not because I was stronger, but because when he beat me, he missed the vital spot." Each witness spoke without drama. They didn't linger. They didn't parade their injuries as proof. They simply made one thing clear. Cole didn't just shoot one person. He left scars on an entire community. Wounds that didn't bleed, but hurt enough to make a nation look back at itself. At the end of the session, Jordan entered. She didn't wear a prosecutor's suit, no badge. Still in a white shirt, her neck bandaged, the wound not yet stitched off. She didn't look at Cole. She looked at the panel, those who once stayed silent before being forced to convene, and said, "If I hadn't survived, would this hearing be happening?" No one answered. She didn't ask again. She just turned away. But after that sentence, the hearing was no longer a procedural review. It became a mirror, and every person in that room, from senators to legal aides, was forced to ask themselves, if justice requires someone to be shot before we convene, what exactly did we let die before that? Under the pale white light of the federal courtroom, where every word could redraw the line between justice and justification, Jordan stood. There was no music, no cheap emotional cues, only the soft click of her shoes on the cold, dry stone floor. She wore a light gray shirt, no jewelry. Faint bruises still visible on her wrist from an old IV needle. No one in the gallery moved. No one dared meet her eyes, because what she was about to say wasn't a testimony. It was an indictment written with sight, from a gaze that no one could erase. "That day," she began, her voice neither high nor low, "he walked up like someone who had the power to decide who got to exist on that stretch of road. Cole, handcuffed, head down in the defendant's chair, didn't look up. He knew that voice. He had heard it when her blood was still smeared on his rearview mirror. But now, it was no longer the voice of a victim. It was the voice of a survivor, carrying a memory sharp as a scalpel. He didn't yell. He didn't hesitate. There was no defensive gesture, only one look. Jordan paused, lifting her eyes straight to the 3 judges. That gaze didn't ask for empathy. It interrogated, as if I were a traffic obstruction, a utility pole, a trash can, something to be removed so his path could be clear. The air in the courtroom contracted like lungs grasping for oxygen. The defense attorney raised his head, ready to object, but the presiding judge's hand lifted, light, slow, firm. No one was to interrupt her. People have asked me why I didn't run. Why didn't I scream? Why didn't I grab something to defend myself? They said I was a federal prosecutor. I should have known how to handle it. But when a barrel is pressed against your forehead and the eyes behind it don't waver, you no longer have a choice. She stopped, not to catch her breath, but so the courtroom could absorb the truth, which sometimes doesn't need to be followed by more words. It only needs to echo at the right time. I didn't die. That's true, but I don't live the same way anymore. Jordan turned her head toward the right-hand screen. Morris's clip, the one recorded by a homeless man, began to play. The sound was low, the image slightly shaky, but clear enough to see the fragmented light of night and a silhouette collapsing after a single gunshot. "I know this clip is hard to watch," she said without turning back. It wasn't filmed with expensive cameras. It's not cinematic. It's just streetlight glare and the broken breathing of someone deemed untrustworthy. The image of Jordan in the video, her head bowed, blood trickling from her temple, the streetlight reflecting off her shirt, made those who had thought she's fine shudder. This is the moment he pulled the trigger. But if all you see is his hand, you won't understand. You need to see his eyes. The screen shifted to a close-up, freeze frame. No hatred, no fear, no moral conflict, just a blank stare, as if death were convenient. As if I disappeared, he'd get his coffee 15 minutes sooner. Jordan turned back and, for the first time, looked directly at Cole. He didn't shoot me because I did something wrong. He shot me because I stood in the wrong place, in his imagination. Below, a young man in a civilian shirt, gripping his notes, began to cry. No one noticed. But the silence in the courtroom was no longer reverent. It was suffocating. I'm not here to testify for fame. I've had a breathing tube removed. I've relearned how to speak. I've been afraid to walk in the dark. And I carry the bullet in my memory. Every day. Jordan stepped forward. Her voice dropped, but no one failed to hear her. What I need you to understand is that this wasn't a personal case. This isn't about me and Cole Merrick. This is a link in a long chain of misperceptions that have been taught, repeated, and legitimized for many years. She looked up at the panel above, where the words, "In God we trust," were engraved. I don't blame God, but I do want to ask, if the law is the secular scripture, then who is rewriting it with violence? No one said a word. Jordan looked down at the documents on the podium, then spoke slowly, each word deliberate. I studied the law. I know how to argue. But today, I don't need to persuade. I just need you not to close your eyes. One judge, the oldest with silver hair who had held his seat for over 3 decades, nodded. He wrote nothing, said nothing, but that nod echoed louder than any sentence ever pronounced. Jordan bowed, not hurriedly, not with the pride of a victor, just with measured steps, descending exactly in rhythm. She didn't need people to rise, because this time no one could stay seated. The courtroom remained silent, but that silence was no void. It was the sound of something beginning to move, something irreversible. And in the fading light of a late afternoon, for the first time, people felt it clearly. Some testimonies don't need persuasion, because they are the truth, so undeniable, they stand on their own. Cole slouched in the holding cell, hands cuffed behind his back, collar crumpled, eyes bloodshot from sleep deprivation. But there wasn't a trace of remorse in him, not because he didn't know fear, but because he had never believed he could lose. To Cole Merrick, being locked behind these concrete walls wasn't punishment, it was an insult. He used to be the one ordering others into the seat across the table. Today, he had to bow his head and answer someone else's questions, and he hated that. Hated it so much, he refused to stay quiet. "Political bastards!" he roared as an FBI agent entered the room. His voice shredded the air, already thick with disinfectant and the smell of old metal. "This isn't law. This is a calculated purge. You're stringing me up to preserve the reputation of some woman who knows how to act." The agent didn't flinch. He'd heard it all. Cole had screamed the same things dozens of times in the past 2 days. He had pounded the table, spat on the floor, hissed accusations like a wounded animal still desperate to bite, but it all bounced off the gray brick walls. No one answered, because everyone knew the man who once believed himself untouchable was unraveling. And the most dangerous part was, he still didn't understand why he lost. "You've got nothing to charge me with," Cole snarled again. "I'm a cop. I have the right to assess threats. I saw her as dangerous. I followed procedure. There's no clause in the procedure that says shoot an unarmed woman in the head," the agent replied flatly. She was driving a government vehicle, a black woman in an SUV without a security detail. Anyone would be suspicious. "She's a federal prosecutor, Merrick." "I didn't know that at the time." "He did," the agent muttered. "He knew because he snatched the badge before he pulled the trigger." Cole went quiet, a rare moment. He didn't deny it, he just stared at his hands. The same hands that had swung batons, snapped cuffs, rested on women's shoulders with a smirk, convinced he was immune to consequence. Today, those hands trembled, not from cold, but because they held nothing now except the truth, and truth didn't come with a holster. Across the hall, the attorney conference room was silent. The lawyer, originally assigned to represent Cole, a seasoned criminal defense attorney with a history of high-profile cases, had submitted a formal refusal. Reason: unwillingness to be associated with a racially motivated shooting of a federal prosecutor. Cole's name was now a scorch mark on legal records. No one wanted to touch it, not even those who once knew him. On social media, a grainy old photo spread like wildfire. A younger Cole in high school, arms around two classmates, wearing a smug grin and a badge from the Patriotic Youth Council. A handwritten caption read, "He said he wanted to be a hero by taking out the right people." Beneath it, a pinned comment read, "And he thought he just had, until the one he shot lived and dismantled the very system that once shielded him." Inside FBI headquarters, a classified internal report surfaced. Cole Merrick had previously been the subject of a covert investigation 4 years earlier for allegedly racially motivated violent conduct. But the evidence had fallen through cameras malfunctioned, witnesses withdrew, or supervisors deemed there was insufficient cause for internal inquiry. Every escape now became a blade turned inward, stabbing the very system that once protected him. And he knew it, but instead of shutting up, he kept screaming. "I'm the one who keeps order. I followed the law. I'm a soldier of the people," he rasped, his voice dull, like a blade worn to nothing. "No," the agent said, standing and closing the file. "You're the product of a rotting discipline, and now you're proof of why it needs to be dismantled." Cole slammed the table. He tried to rise, but the cuffs yanked him down, just like the truth pulled down the mouth of a man who once lived off lies. Sweat streaked down his face. The air grew heavier, not from heat, but from the combustion of belief. The slow collapse of a man who once thought he was invincible. No one in the investigative team looked at him like a person anymore. They looked at him like a relic, once painted in badges, weapons, and authority, now stripped to a dull gray mass of bitterness and denial. On the wall, the clock ticked without pause. The second hand moved as if it had never been interrupted by shouting, spit, or curses. But to Cole, every tick was another indictment. No one stopped the clock for him. No one called him officer anymore. No one believed he had ever represented the law. In that pale white room, where every brick now stared back with rot, the man who once believed himself untouchable finally learned one thing: no one is immune to truth, especially when he is the living proof of a lie that had decayed to its core. And for the first time in his life, Cole had nothing to say, not because he felt guilty, but because he understood the people outside had stopped listening to him a long time ago, and now he couldn't even hear himself anymore. As the final pleas dissolved into the fog-drenched morning outside the federal courthouse, no one in the room still believed this was just another trial. The air was thick, taut like water about to rupture, and every eye was locked on the 3 high-backed chairs where the judges sat. One of them tapped the gavel lightly on the wooden bench, a sound that rippled through the taut flesh of every person present. No one moved, no one coughed, because everyone understood. This moment wasn't merely the close of a legal proceeding. It was the judgment on an entire era, veiled in badges and fortified by unchecked power. After reviewing all evidence, witness testimonies, federal investigative reports, and findings from the Oversight Committee, the presiding judge began. His voice not merely sound but weight. The United States Federal Court finds the defendant, Cole Merrick, guilty of first-degree murder with the aggravating factor of racially motivated intent against a federal prosecutor in the execution of her duty. The air seemed to stop moving. Into court sentences: life imprisonment, without parole, without the possibility of early appeal. A soft sound, maybe a gasp, maybe a stifled sob, flickered through the chamber. but was quickly extinguished by the closing line of the verdict, sharp as the final blade severing all the ropes Cole once believed could hold him up, because to fire on the keeper of justice is to betray the very concept of the rule of law. Cole didn't react. He sat frozen, statue-like, eyes wide but void of the usual flame, just bloodshot irises, as if burning from the ruins inside. No more shouting, no more clawing, only one thing remained. The space where he once thought his reputation was untouchable, now a hollow wreckage. A soldier of the law stripped of rank in the very fortress he once thought was his trench. Jordan stood. She didn't look around. She didn't smile. She simply walked to the victim's podium, as the law permitted, and as life had once tried to take from her, the right to speak while still breathing. She held no papers, no badge, no symbols except the white band still wrapped around her neck since the day she was shot. She stood upright, the overhead lights glinting off a face untouched by makeup, steady, lucid, and without a trace of tremor. "Cole Merrick," she said, her voice straight and flat, like a line drawn through a judgment. "Thank you for not killing me." The room fell still. Those expecting a declaration of triumph were left suspended mid-thought. "Because if you had killed me that day," Jordan continued without pause, "I would never have lived to see you tried." Cole tilted his head, as if confused, but in truth he understood all too well. That exact moment when his finger released the trigger just slightly off target, letting the bullet graze bone instead of tearing through, was the moment he signed his indictment. Jordan's survival became the evidence no one could refute, and now she wielded her existence as a verdict higher than any issued by a court. "Thank you," she repeated, not for him this time, but for those who once tried to silence her, who mistook her quiet for weakness, who thought justice was a wound that could be cleansed with administrative paperwork. She stepped down. No one blocked her. No one surged forward to take pictures, because everyone knew every word she spoke wasn't meant for cameras or news headlines. It was for the invisible fractures inside those who once believed wrong, and now had to live with the truth. To the right, one of the judges, the oldest member on the panel, rose unexpectedly, quietly. He removed his glasses, set them on the stack of files, and then walked out of the courtroom without a glance back. No one asked why, because when the sunlight caught his eyes, just briefly, they had already answered, in a language no transcript could capture. A reckoning long delayed, but real. Cole was led away. He didn't resist, said no last words, uttered no curses. He only turned to look back at the gallery, where every gaze now reflected the caricature of himself he once projected. But no one looked at him as a man. They looked at him as the cost society finally decided to pay, after too many years of letting something like him exist without scrutiny. The door slammed shut. A single sound, but final, like the punctuation mark at the end of a chapter written in blood, arrogance, and near death. No one stood to applaud. No one cheered, because justice isn't a song with a feel-good chorus. It's a deep incision, and today the blade had landed where it belonged, not to thrill, but to stop more blood from being spilled by eyes once deemed traffic obstructions. And in that ending, no triumph, no triumph. The only thing left behind was a silence no one could erase, the silence of a sentence without mercy, and a name that now existed only as a warning to anyone who ever believed the law could be a shield from murder and life would simply go on. Not long after the courtroom door slammed shut behind Cole Merrick, another door was forced open, this time not in a courthouse, but in a quiet northern residential block once known as the haven for retired senior officers. And on a still, uneventful morning, without sirens, without fire, without a single scream of alarm, federal agents knocked on the door of Sergeant Dana Wickley, the woman who once sat behind the desk of internal command, adjusting every report, every camera feed, every incoming call from problem zones. Kathy Giffords, later management director for Wickley, opened the door in silk pajamas, a coffee mug in hand, her expression utterly unsurprised. "You're later than I expected," she said, her voice flat and measured, as if greeting guests, not officers bearing a warrant. When one of the agents held out a sealed document with a red federal stamp, she only raised an eyebrow. I assume nobody wanted to arrest me at the old HQ? Too many members. The way she stepped out, without resistance, without cursing, without slamming the door or yelling into the camera, was more chilling than any suspect previously cuffed. Because in Wickley, there was no panic, only a numb, calculating coldness. Sergeant Dana Wickley, you are charged with concealing evidence, ordering the alteration of incident reports, and unlawfully interfering with surveillance data in no fewer than 4 cases involving Officer Cole Merrick, the agent read aloud, each word sharp as a blade. Concealing is such a heavy word, she said with a dry laugh. I call it administrative streamlining. Even as the cuffs clicked into place, Wickley's face didn't crack. But that wasn't a strength. It was the residue of a mask worn for so long she no longer knew where it ended and her skin began. The internal tribunal was closed to the press, but packed with federal personnel. No television cameras were allowed, yet every gaze in the room was as sharp as a lens. Wickley was brought in through the rear entrance, still in a white shirt, her hair neatly tied, her face blank. She sat like someone clocking out from a dated office shift, waiting to be told how things got so messy. Sergeant Wickley, do you have anything to say? The prosecutor asked. Wickley stared directly ahead, her blink cadence unbroken. I was following orders. I didn't pull the trigger. The response hit like a slap across the face of every prior excuse uttered in past disciplinary hearings. No deflection, no environment blame, just one justification, and that was the problem. The system didn't need someone to order the kill. It only needed someone willing to close their eyes and comply. A young officer, no more than 29, blonde, wearing a pale blue shirt, stood up from the back row. His voice cracked like a steel rod buckling under pressure. You're the one who taught me how to pull the trigger without leaving a mark. Every head in the room turned. Wickley didn't. She didn't lower her gaze. She looked up at the ceiling as if the accusation was merely another scene in a daily play. That composure didn't conceal guilt. It exposed something far worse. She never believed it was wrong. Jordan was present. She didn't sit in the witness section, nor did she need to step up. She simply stood at the back, among the observers, but when she spoke, her words sliced through every wall of defense. Doing wrong is a crime, Jordan said, eyes fixed on Wickley. But turning wrong into procedure, that's the real evil. Wickley turned her head for the first time during the entire hearing and looked straight at Jordan, not with hostility, not with remorse, just a cold acknowledgement that everything she had ever done, deleted, taught, and ignored had just been named for what it truly was. No rebuttal remained. No one in the room needed more evidence, because sometimes silence isn't evasion. It's the final admission. The prosecutor closed the file without another word. The sentence wasn't declared yet, but the moral verdict had been delivered, and as Dana Wickley was led out of the chamber, for the first time she was no longer seen as a sergeant, nor merely as a criminal. She was seen as a fallen emblem, the last mask ripped away, exposing a system once built on verbal cues, knowing glances, and nods that required no signatures. And this time, no one cried. No one stood in shock. There was only a slow, creeping cold, like winter fog, as people realized justice doesn't arrive solely when bullets are stopped, but when the hands that once aimed them at civilians are no longer called command. The final mask had fallen, and it didn't shatter. It simply became useless, because no one believed in its glitter anymore. When the final door closed behind Dana Wickley and the last mask of the system fell without a sound, another wave began to rise, not from the courtroom, not from the investigation rooms, but erupting across glowing screens, sensational headlines, and millions of fingertips rewriting what they once believed to be true. The media, the same force that once stayed silent or vilified Jordan while she lay in a hospital bed, had now become a battlefield of chaos, where every sentence turned its blade inward shredding the moral veneer that had existed for far too long. The Morning Ledger, which had once accused Jordan of undermining public trust in law enforcement, ran a headline with exactly 44 characters. "We trusted the man who pulled the trigger more than the woman who upheld the law." Beneath it was an editorial with no images, no frills, no ads. Just one bolded first sentence: "To remain silent when truth is being distorted, it is not journalistic error, it is a betrayal of justice." A veteran editor who had previously cut several early segments on Jordan for being unverified submitted his resignation. In a handwritten letter, inked in blue, sent to Jordan via an independent journalist, he wrote, "I doubted you, not because of the evidence, but because of my prejudice against a black woman driving a government SUV. I trusted my flawed instinct over the truth you never needed to scream. I'm sorry I was silent when I should have spoken." The letter spread in less than 6 hours. It was screenshotted, reposted, quoted in hundreds of podcasts, morning and evening broadcasts, talk shows, op-eds, and even tweets that once seemed innocuous. But soon the hashtag #ShotTheLaw began to surge, first as an emotional response, then as a public indictment, and finally as a movement to unmask a system that thought it could manipulate collective trust. 5 million, 15 million, 45 million, and then no one could pinpoint the moment it hit 500 million views. All they knew was that by then a government-run social media account had been forced to issue a public apology for failing to properly verify information cited about the Jordan case. One tweet sparked hundreds of thousands of replies. "When justice is shot, don't ask why the law is no longer trusted." Channels that once mocked Jordan for making it bigger than it is began rebroadcasting their old footage, not to justify, but to measure it against a reality now exploding in their faces. WTV's evening broadcast opened with footage of Jordan leaving Cole's courtroom, overlaid with narration. When a black woman refuses to die according to the narrative the media wrote for her, the question is no longer who she is, but what we thought she was. Across online forums, past articles that condemned Jordan were now struck through, rewritten and rebutted by the very people who once nodded in agreement. A collective reckoning unfolded without ritual, without sanctuaries. Just the light of cell phone screens flaring up like an unexpected blaze, burning through the dust of hypocrisy on viewers' shoulders. Jordan gave no press interviews. She issued no statements. She didn't write a book, didn't appear on television, and didn't accept honorary guest invites. She simply returned to work, appearing quietly at a student law symposium. When the host introduced her with a list of accolades, Jordan interrupted gently, her voice soft as a turning page. "I'm not a victim. I'm living proof of a law that was bent and then straightened again by the very people it once ignored." Her silence did not quiet the media storm. On the contrary, the more she stayed away, the more her name echoed, because people needed a face for the failure they once enabled. And when that face refused praise, it became a symbol more unshakable than any medal or slogan. Segments reanalyzing the Wickel trial were remeditated. Commentators who once called Jordan cold and distant now praised her unyielding clarity. A famous morning show host removed her earpiece live, looked straight into the camera and said, "We once criticized her for staying silent. Now, we understand she was quiet, so we'd hear our voices for once." And in the whirlwind of media reversal, it wasn't Jordan who changed. It was the lens through which she was seen, no longer fogged by bias. She didn't win through rhetoric. She made the public retreat, look inward, and realize the truth doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs not to be smothered by microphones aimed at the wrong people. Like a storm with no warning, the late apologies, the flipped headlines, the hashtags burning like oaths. Together they charted a new public consciousness, where the once suspected no longer had to justify, and the once defended had nowhere left to stand. Justice, when shot, does not die. It returns. In the form of a woman walking forward without a shield, without fanfare, without decoration, carrying only one truth. She had been shot, but lived to prove that not everyone with a badge should be trusted, and not everyone who stays silent is weak. The crowd turned, but this time not to cheer, to bow. As the media tide turned and Jordan's silence became an indelible symbol, she took an unexpected step, not by writing a book, accepting speaking engagements, or joining any advocacy group. Instead, she filed a single legal document, bearing her unflinching signature, composed in a tone as cold as it was precise, with a title printed in bold uppercase letters that read like a warning: complaint against the city administrative system for establishing a failed oversight structure leading to racially motivated crime. This was no longer a confrontation between an individual and a police officer. It was a lawsuit against the very shadow behind which every mayor, police chief, HR director, and oversight board had once hidden when asked why. Jordan no longer targeted the one who pulled the trigger. She aimed at the hand that placed the gun in his grip and then looked away, as if uninvolved. "This is the second lawsuit," a reporter stated in a special broadcast, "but it's not about convicting a person. It's about exposing the mechanism that allowed someone to believe they could act with impunity." The federal court accepted the filing within 24 hours. Less than a week later, the city's legal departments received subpoenas demanding the disclosure of all internal records from the past 12 years, including suppressed complaints, unsigned disciplinary reports, altered training documents, and internal memos once marked for internal circulation only. The dust on the paper hadn't yet settled, but the stench of decay was already overwhelming. The initial hearing lacked sensational visuals. Only one figure stepped onto the stand, bearing the weight of a city's collective memory: former Mayor Maxwell Grant. The silver-haired man, donning a black tie, adjusted his glasses before speaking, not to apologize, nor to bow his head. Yet his voice sliced through the silence. "We knew there were issues," he admitted, without evasion. "We knew the oversight structure within our police department had flaws, but we hesitated to intervene because it was too vast and because it was too familiar." His statement wasn't a confession. It was a slap to all who had labeled silence as political strategy. For when a system chooses inaction out of fear of backlash, each moment of silence becomes a bullet waiting to be fired. The plaintiff's presentation, compiled by a team of volunteer attorneys and federal oversight experts, included reports never before made public. One excerpt read, "The 2017 complaint was handled internally. No sufficient evidence warranted a hearing, yet directly beneath it was an internal recording revealing that Dana Wickley had ordered the deletion of original data before forwarding the file to the supervisor." The power structure unfolded clearly, not as a web, but as a sewage pipeline, twisted, dark, and flowing unseen for years, emptying into rivers everyone presumed were clean. Amidst all the dry evidence, bureaucratic documents, and jargon-laden testimonies, Jordan stood up only once. She named no one, accused no one, pointed at no official who had neglected investigations. She posed a single question, enough to render further debate unnecessary. The one who pulled the trigger has been apprehended, but whose hand placed the gun in his? For a moment, no one breathed, because everyone knew they had once been that hand. By overlooking, by remaining silent, by believing that's HR's concern, or we're awaiting the new budget, or challenging the police risks losing votes. Days later, under mounting pressure from the community and Congress, the U.S. Department of Justice issued an official statement: a nationwide reform of state and city police training programs. The reforms mandated courses on internal behavior assessment through human rights law perspectives, reevaluation of oversight models, and increased independence for external investigative boards. The announcement came on a Monday morning, an ordinary day that now marked a structural shift, a moment when the lawsuit transcended prosecution to touch the core that had long been untouchable, the right to question those in power. When television replayed the moment Jordan exited the federal courthouse, the anchor no longer introduced her as the victim who was shot. Instead, she was recognized by the role she had chosen, not appointed, not lauded, but universally acknowledged: the woman who compelled the system to prove it still deserved to exist. Because beyond every bullet, every denial, every belated apology, true justice doesn't reside in the first verdict. It lies in the second lawsuit, when we not only ask who fired the shot, but dare to inquire who handed him the gun. As the second lawsuit shook the very foundations of the oversight system, the ensuing question was no longer about who would be held accountable, but rather how many other institutions are teaching individuals to turn a blind eye to the truth, all in the name of credentials and titles. The answer arrived sooner than many anticipated. Just 36 hours after the Department of Justice announced its reform measures, the North Hills Police Academy, where both Cole Merrick and Dana Wickley had trained, was indefinitely suspended. No raids were necessary. No internal investigations were launched. A brief federal statement sufficed. The training program fails to meet ethical standards of the profession. The news spread swiftly, yet without fanfare. No special bulletins aired. No analytical talk shows were convened. However, within private forums of law and law enforcement students, internal emails among academies, and niche judicial newsletters, the name North Hills became an indelible stain on the educational record. At an impromptu press conference, the Academy's principal, once hailed as the gatekeeper of ethical standards in state police training, was absent. Instead, Professor Benjamin Rowe, a public ethics lecturer, stepped forward. His voice trembled, but his words were unequivocal. For 20 years, I took pride in teaching ethics to classes here. I believed I was molding individuals who upheld both the law and their conscience. But now, I feel nothing but revulsion because, in those very lectures, individuals like Cole Merrick sat, listened, and learned how to deceive the system through the very gaps we were too afraid to address. No applause followed. No voices rose in support. There was no need for an ovation in response to a confession delivered too late. All that remained was a heavy silence, thick and suffocating, like the ash after a fire alarm that was never sounded. The Academy's graduation ceremony, planned before the scandal erupted, proceeded as scheduled. There were no fireworks. No bands played. No media coverage ensued. Only a scattering of occupied seats, a few ceremonial robes worn out of obligation, and downcast eyes unsure of where to focus. Then, just as the announcer stepped up to declare the first intern's name, a figure rose from the middle rows. Rory Quinn, a final-year student in crime scene investigation. He pulled his internship certificate from his chest pocket, held it aloft, and tore it in half before the microphone could capture the sparse applause. He said nothing. He did not bow. He simply exited the row, the sound of plastic chairs scraping against the cold stone floor marking his departure. An amateur photographer captured the moment. The photo lacked slogans or ornate backdrops. It featured only an upraised hand, a torn certificate, and the silhouette of a man walking away from a system he was once poised to serve. That image later graced the cover of Law and Integrity magazine under the singular headline, "Graduating from Silence." As all eyes turned to the quiet collapse of an academy once deemed a crucible for the elite, the auditorium doors unexpectedly opened a second time. No one entered in information, no guide led the way, no microphone announced the arrival. Jordan, no one knew who had invited her. No one knew if her name was on the guest list. But when she appeared in the back row, clad in a charcoal coat, the outline of an old bandage still visible at her wrist, all ceremonial formalities became redundant. She did not ascend the stage. She did not speak. She accepted no flowers. She did not participate in the distribution of certificates. She merely sat there, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the podium, a place that had once produced a generation she had to survive to challenge. A young lecturer attempted to approach her, perhaps to invite her to speak, but Jordan gently shook her head. No words, no need. In that moment, it became clear. Her presence was the declaration. Some truths, when spoken, can cause upheaval, but others, when left unspoken, compel an entire system to introspect and ask, what have we been teaching? and who has mastered these lessons so thoroughly that truth itself becomes a political game. Credentials are no longer a shield. Every badge, every title, every diploma is now scrutinized under a single lens. Did it serve justice or merely? And Jordan, through a silence as weighty as a verdict, posed that question more profoundly than any speech could. In a ceremony no one wished to hold, she sat, unheralded, unintroduced, but everyone knew she was the sole individual in that hall whom history would remember, not because she survived, but because she compelled those once dubbed students of the law to tear up their certificates before they could commit wrongdoing. Not long after the cold, joyless graduation ceremony, where Jordan sat like a silent shadow among chairs long occupied by the wrong people, a golden-sealed envelope arrived at her office. It was thick, formal, and hand-delivered by a federal agent, not through the Postal Service. Inside was a black ink invitation printed on smooth paper, bearing the United States seal at the top corner. The first line was written in solemn, all-capital letters. The Office of the President cordially invites Prosecutor Jordan Arlen to the White House to receive the Medal of Freedom. No one was surprised. After all, the media had already assigned Jordan every possible title: survivor, system challenger, the woman who made the law rewrite itself. A medal, though delayed, seemed like the logical epilogue to the public image that had been constructed. Only Jordan didn't see it as an ending. She did not go to the White House. She didn't send a response letter. She didn't authorize anyone to attend on her behalf. It wasn't until the awards ceremony was publicly announced that her spokesperson sent the press a single excerpt, 13 words, without elaboration. A medal can't cover the bullets that haven't been fired yet. No one understood better than she did. Truth doesn't reside in medals. It lives in the space between the bullet that hissed past her temple and the hundreds of others. Yet to hiss, yet to echo, but still embedded somewhere in the system, in judgments, in prejudice, in undocumented verbal orders, in the silent smirks exchanged across rows of power. In the days that followed, while television networks unanimously hailed her as a symbol of noble humility, something else quietly spread across the internet: a short cell phone video capturing the moment the man once known as the architect of public response suppression policy walked out of a closed-door meeting at the Department of Justice and was blocked by a group of young law students. They didn't protest. They chanted no slogans. They simply stood in a line, each holding a white board that read, "If you once silenced others, now it's your turn." He said nothing, didn't smile, didn't move forward. He only stepped back, gazing up at the overhead sign, as if searching for an exit in a building he had designed but where no doors remained open for a man who had survived by complicity. A few days later, on the private page of a prestigious law school, an anonymous account shared a screenshot of an internal email from over 3 years ago, in which that same man had explicitly requested the removal of Jordan Arlen from the federal legal training program for political influence. The email surprised no one familiar with the system, but this time it came with one caption: "The reason you hated her is the reason we learn from her." A magazine that once published an editorial attacking Jordan, accusing her of trying to turn survival into a moral framework rather than accepting personal failure, suddenly changed the cover of its latest issue. No prosecutor's photo, just a black void with a single white line at the bottom. The court may acquit, but time does not. The old editorial was removed without explanation, yet a source from the newsroom confirmed over 300 subscription cancellations had come in from academic readers within just 1 week. The resistance didn't come from crowds. It came from individual names that carried weight, people who had never publicly sided with Jordan, but had also never dared to turn fully against her. As for him, the man who once called Jordan's decision the emotional impulse of a woman who puts feelings above law, now lived in a gray zone where no one needed to attack him to cast him out. One morning, as he tried to enter a conference auditorium, the receptionist gently held his hand back and asked for his name. After a few seconds of checking, she smiled politely but firmly. "We couldn't find any registration under your name. Perhaps the system auto-deleted it." No one looked his way. No one demanded he leave, but he understood. This was the highest form of expulsion, to be forgotten by the system, as if he had never existed or never deserved to. The publishing house that had once signed a deal for his memoir also formally canceled the project. No reason was recorded in the meeting minutes, but later their website pinned a short notice at the top. "We do not retell the past to cleanse the writer's hands. We retell it to keep the reader's memory from being manipulated." That very notice was shared by Jordan's former assistant, the one who had remained silent for 3 years after the hearings, as an unspoken declaration, and by now, every title, every medal, every word of praise had become redundant. Jordan's existence never needed a badge to be remembered. She never returned to the White House. She never asked to be greeted by flags or fanfare. But whenever a new paper opens a discussion on justice and silence, whenever a law student drafts a thesis on power and its limits, whenever a public servant stands on the edge between right and wrong under flickering fluorescent lights, Jordan Arlen's name will appear, not as a character, but as a moral mirror, needing no spotlight, needing no frame. No one understood better than she did. The truth did not lie in medals. It lay in the distance between the bullet that had hissed past her temple and the hundreds of others, still unscreamed, still silent, but still lodged somewhere in the system, in judgments, in biases, in undocumented verbal orders, in the quiet smiles exchanged among rows of power. No one was warned, and no one imagined the system would bow in that manner. After years of evasive justifications, after hundreds of documents claiming insufficient basis for action, after hearings where her name was used as a PR tool to dissipate public pressure, the last thing they sent her was the one thing she never expected: a handwritten letter. No colored heading, no political declarations, just 3 neatly written paragraphs on plain white paper, bearing the seal and signature of the White House legal counsel. So discreet that had it not been hand-delivered by a security agent, one could have mistaken it for a private confession, not a government document. The letter did not attempt to defend itself. It stopped at a stark, cold admission that the long-maintained silence had never stemmed from lack of evidence, but from the fear of losing face in front of a public that once believed in that very system. A silent fear, sharp as a blade, that had led them to abandon a woman with a fractured skull and a buried report, to stand alone in a building where she once worked, stripped of her government badge and accused by a moral indictment that was only dismissed after public demand for video evidence. "We apologize for letting one of our citizens survive when she should have been allowed to simply live," the letter read, and no further explanation was needed to understand. There are lives that are permitted to exist, but not allowed peace. And that, in itself, was the true indictment of those who once wore suits in the name of law. She did not give that letter to the media, nor did she keep it as a medal behind glass. It was never displayed at any graduation, never shown on any slideshow at future legal reform conferences, because she knew no apology could restore the months she had spent convincing a nation that even a stray bullet could be deliberate if it came from a shooter exempt from question. And because she also knew, should that confession be held under a spotlight, dozens of mouths would seize it instantly to claim that justice had been restored, but she did not live to help them restore it. No rumors. A quiet shift had begun. No one launched it, no hashtags appeared, but small courtrooms quietly revoked precedents once authored by the antagonist. Executive conferences removed his name from speaker lists without comment. Invitations were rescinded without reason. Scheduled news segments were dropped minutes before airtime, all appearing like fine fractures on a sheet of glass thought unbreakable. There was no sound of shattering, but everyone could feel the shift. And then the man who had once sat across from Jordan in the battle, who had once stood in a boardroom and dismissed her compensation petition with the words, "insufficient grounds for misconduct," was seen exiting a government building through a side door. No protest, but the door behind him did not close. And that image, uncut, unaltered, was captured in a student documentary on structural evasion, which spread across academic platforms as a symbol of silent collapse without rebuttal. No one said his name, but all eyes turned toward that image, where a man, once called a pillar of justice, now walked faster than his footsteps could echo. Collapse did not come through direct strikes. It came through how, one by one, people began to stop referencing him as a legitimate source. His name was not deleted from books, but no longer cited. His old papers remained, but now bore disclaimers. No longer recommended. No one called it a movement, but its impact ran deeper than any formal investigation. When a person is no longer deemed worth arguing with, they are no longer worth remembering. And in academia, being forgotten by those who once used your words to teach others is the most painful form of erasure. Jordan did not grant interviews. She did not accept invitations from those who had once rejected her petition and now asked her to appear on air as a voice of healing. She declined every new title, not out of pride, but because she understood. If a system needs survivors to patch its moral breaches, then no one should volunteer to be the patch. And if there is one lesson she left for the young students who still believed in something called professional responsibility, it was this: the refusal to become a convenient narrative. She was not a symbol. She was proof that some truths, once exposed, will never allow themselves to be reburied, no matter how many layers of honor are wrapped around them. Jordan did not publish the letter. She did not frame it in glass. It lay inside a locked drawer, beneath dozens of copies of legal complaints, investigation files, and a scanned image of her cranial injury she never looked at a second time. After that letter came another offer, this time not from the administration, but from a special bipartisan committee backed by Congress to erect a statue of Jordan Arlen at the National Mall between the memorials for law enforcement officers and victims of gun violence. A 3-meter-tall statue, carved from Italian white marble, inscribed with a line taken from her testimony, "I didn't die, but I no longer live the same." The vote for that proposal passed unanimously. But just a few hours later, Jordan sent a short fax, only 2 lines, written in black ink. "I respectfully decline. I don't need to be carved in stone. I need what was once carved in stone to be erased." No further explanation, but none was needed. Anyone who had ever heard her speak, who had seen her stand, not on a stage of honor, but in the middle of a hearing room, her hand still trembling after surgery, still facing the camera, understood. She was not against remembrance, but she knew statues are often built so people can stop questioning, stop asking, stop remembering clearly, stop being ashamed, and stop changing. She didn't survive so people could take photos and move on. She survived to force the system to stop, look, and answer. Will the next person have to take a stray bullet just to be heard? Her refusal left the entire chamber in silence, not out of offense, but because it exposed what no one dared to say aloud, that the system was trying to forgive itself through her, rather than truly change. She understood, and she refused to be the symbol of its absolution. Behind political curtains, those who had once been temporary allies began to waver. Some cabinet members who had carefully spun the administration's silence as time needed for verification now faced a wave of questions from the very young people studying under Jordan. In a leaked internal dialogue, a senior advisor muttered into a still live microphone, "She's giving us no way out," but that very sentence, stripped from context, became a new emblem for the legal reform movement. Pensions, papers, banners, essays, and podcasts everywhere echoed that line with biting irony. She gives the system no way out, and rightly so. The man who once sat opposite her, who had dismissed every petition, who had signed off on closing the case, could no longer find stable ground. At a Justice Sector event in Boston, he stepped onto the stage with an old medal on his chest, ready to speak about the enduring role of due process. But the microphone flickered, and the stage lights failed to turn on. The organizers remained silent. No technical malfunction was reported, but everyone present knew the lights weren't out by accident. They were out because no one wanted to hear him represent anything anymore. Throughout his speech, he spoke alone, uninterrupted, unheckled, but no one clapped, no one took notes, no one stood when he finished. There was no protest, no disruption. That emptiness, that silence, was the cruelest form of exposure a community could offer to someone who once manipulated justice with the skill of concealment. In the years that followed, he applied to join a professional advisory board, a circle he once frequented, but his application was denied without explanation. Internally, board members passed around a single line: does not meet the standard of reflection. No debates, no op-eds in protest, but no one invited him to the table again. In the world of law, punishment does not always come from the courts. Sometimes it comes from a handshake that never arrives. As for Jordan, she continued to decline every nomination. A major university once proposed naming a scholarship after her, but she responded, "If there's still money for nameplates, use it to buy legal aid tools for those wrongfully detained." The university gave no public reply. But that year, a grant was transferred to a civil protection fund, with a note, in honor of someone who does not need a statue. Her name wasn't mentioned on the award stages, but in classrooms, lectures, mock trials, and legal conferences, people began referring to the survivor as a designation, not a personal name, not a biography. And that designation, quietly but firmly, began to replace the old models that taught justice comes only after patience. Because now people understood some don't live to wait. They live to force the system to shorten that wait, even if only by one day. She didn't survive to become a symbol of reconciliation. She survived to prove that injustice does not need a glorious ending. It needs a beginning, forced to face itself. She did not need to be cast in bronze. She needed the names once etched into stone to be questioned again. And when everything quieted, when public attention shifted to another scandal, when networks cut programming mid-adjective on institutional ethics, when politicians returned to budget debates, one thing remained unchanged: that black ink facts, reprinted on ordinary paper, without a logo, without a frame, without glass, but quietly taped to the doors of more than 20 law school classrooms across America, I respectfully decline. I don't need to be carved in stone. I need what was once carved in stone to be erased. She survived to force the system to stop, look, and answer. Will the next one still need a stray bullet to be heard? And then, in an unexpected interview with an independent journalist, when asked why she refused every form of recognition, Jordan simply responded with half a smile and a single sentence: because justice doesn't need monuments. It needs to be kept alive every single day. No one could argue with that, because those who once held medals, who had impressive resumes, who stood on podiums of honor, were the very people who pulled the trigger, who deleted the footage, who pushed people like her to the lowest tier of the right to live. And in an era where titles had long been used as shields to deflect responsibility, Jordan, with her quiet refusal, had proven this. Survivors don't need medals. They need no one else to survive the way they did. Some scars don't need gold or silver. Some memories can't be pinned to a ribbon. There are victories not etched in stone, but preserved only through daily vigilance by a society that once fell asleep beneath the laws it had written itself. And in a world still wavering between recognition and forgetting, between praise and action, Jordan Arlen chose not to step onto the stage. She chose to remain in the shadow of collective memory, where her silence continues to ring like a final alarm, not so that anyone would kneel before her statue, but so everyone would rise before their reflection under the overcast September sky. The Georgetown campus seemed to have aged a few more years. The stone steps worn smooth by generations of footsteps, the white-painted wooden windows tinged with fairy tale nostalgia, and the heavy wooden door leading to Lecture Hall A205, where judges, senators, and senior advisors once sat as students, swung open today without the sound of a gavel or the usual opening announcement. No one looked up right away, but something in the air silenced the entire room, as if the familiar acoustics of academia were pulled into the gravitational force of the one who had just walked in. Jordan Arlen wasn't wearing a judicial robe or an official badge. She didn't need to. A simple charcoal suit, neatly tied back hair, a tarnished silver ring on her left ring finger, and a thick teaching folder without a colored cover made her indistinguishable from any ordinary lecturer. But those eyes could never be faked. The same gaze that had once compelled a perjuring witness to recant mid-testimony, the same stare that had frozen a disciplinary board into silence, despite holding a verdict in hand. And now, that same gaze swept across nearly 100 young faces, students who had never known the feeling of drafting a last-minute appeal for an innocent man about to face execution. No one spoke. There was no welcome, no applause like the kind reserved for legendary professors. Only silence, the only language powerful enough to receive someone who had declined to become a legend. Jordan placed her folder on the lectern, without glancing at the nameplate, without calling roll. She opened the file, flipped straight to the first page, looked up, and spoke slowly, carving each word into the air. "I'm not good at law. I just survived when the law was bent." No pen clicks, no whispering, only total focus, as if the whole room was bracing for a storm. No one dared interrupt. Meanwhile, just a few blocks away, a man stood at a checkout counter. His suit was wrinkled and worn, his silver-dyed hair uneven, and his library card was curtly rejected by a young clerk who explained that the system had upgraded its ethical filter based on public records. No one looked at him with hatred, but no one looked at him like he was still the man who once held federal prosecutorial power over life and dignity. The silence here wasn't respect, it was rejection, a form of mute contempt. Some verdicts require no gavel. On social media, no one mentioned his name with seriousness anymore. Once a moral figurehead in many lectures, now every time someone accidentally quoted his old lines, the comments flooded with sarcasm. That from an outdated textbook. Was that quote updated post-hearing? Or worse, just a trash bin emoji. Once, an anonymous account posted an old photo of him shaking hands with a Supreme Court justice at a formal ceremony. His face was covered with a red expired stamp. The post got over 300,000 shares in 2 hours. No one defended him. No one cited his legacy. Because in the world of law, what's been buried is never small, and when the truth resurfaces, memory is re-examined like evidence. People began to rewrite the old narratives. News headlines that once praised his iron discipline were quietly edited or removed. Photos of him with law students, once hung in university hallways, were taken down, not by administrative decree, but by students themselves. A collective letter was sent to the school board. "We don't study to become winners. We study to be the kind of people who don't have to win by making others lose." No author was listed, but nearly 200 signatures appeared. Among them were at least 5 of Jordan's former students. Across town, a small used bookstore began selling limited editions of the textbook Constitutional Public Law, with an appendix annotated by Jordan herself. No ads, no PR, but every copy sold out within a day. One anonymous buyer left a note on the first page. "You didn't need the court to win. The man who once held power no longer receives invitations to speak. Instead, there are retracted invites, silent cancellations of honorary seats, and name cards scratched out before ever reaching their recipients. His name vanished from advisory boards. A law school that once named its scholarship after him quietly renamed it the Arlen Fellowship, with no ceremony. This is punishment by silence. No blood, no verdict, no one slamming a desk or shouting in rage. Yet every small gesture, every averted glance, every unspoken omission has begun rewriting his place in legal history. No longer at the lectern, no longer in the halls of honor, but in cautionary tales, too sharp to be spoken aloud. In Lecture Hall A225, a soft breeze drifted through a cracked open window, ruffling the corner of Jordan's teaching notes. She didn't flinch, nor did she pause to observe her students' reactions, because what she needed to say had already been written through the way she lived, not in cascading arguments. And then, amid the scent of aged paper and chalk dust, that voice, believed to have faded after a seismic public hearing, rose again, low and clear as ever. I'm not good at law. I just survived after the law was bent. No pen taps. No buzzing phones. That opening line wasn't a lesson. It was a reckoning. It introduced a subject not found in the official curriculum, a course taught only by those who had once been targeted by the system and had survived long enough to come back and teach it. The law does not exist for itself. The law exists to protect those it once ignored. Jordan didn't teach through theory. She didn't diagram clauses. She taught as if dissecting a body that had undergone emergency surgery, layer by layer, every vein, every organ, still marked by the scalpel the system once wielded. Students couldn't write fast enough, because each example was a wound, and each wound a truth they had never been taught, that sometimes the scariest thing in the legal system isn't the violation, but the quiet permission behind the name procedure. She didn't recount the case that had made her a household name. She never mentioned the man who once stood on the opposite side, who had flown the banner of justice to protect its opposite. But the legal world does not forget easily, and a society that has awakened does not forgive easily either. The former antagonist, once celebrated as a purified symbol of the system, could no longer find a place within the very structure he once dominated. He once showed up at a state-level legal conference, but at the gate, his name had already been crossed off the guest list. A security guard returned his name badge, now blacked out with marker, and uttered one flat sentence: "Today's list does not include those who once silenced witnesses." He didn't react, but a video, recorded incidentally by a student, captured him turning away, walking out of the convention grounds in the slanted autumn light, shoulders slumped, gait unsteady, and quickly became the most widely shared clip that week. The caption read simply, "When the system returns the proper place to the man who once crowned himself judge." Less than a week later, a group of final-year law students organized a symposium titled "Legal Language and the Ethics of Evasion." No names were mentioned, but in the final presentation, one student stood, held up a printed copy of the once-buried case file, turned to the live stream camera, and said, "I won't practice my delivery while I'm still learning how not to stay silent." The auditorium erupted, not applause for the words, but for the feeling that law no longer belonged solely to those who could define what was right. Elsewhere, a publishing house that had planned to co-marry the memoir of the disgraced man was forced to cancel due to public response. But the real reason didn't need hiding. Every major distributor had refused to carry it. A senior editor quietly wrote in an internal email, "We don't print paper to launder someone else's blood." That email was leaked, and people weren't outraged. They shared it. The tipping point came when a first-year law student was advised by a professor to learn to stay neutral until you've seen enough of the system. The student didn't argue. She stood, pulled from her backpack a thick printout with no glossy cover, only a white page bearing a bold black title, placed it on the professor's desk, and walked out. She said nothing, but every other student recognized the title. An open-access PDF Jordan had uploaded without a release date. No press statement, no book signing. The title wasn't catchy, it wasn't a slogan, it wasn't a call to action. It was a truth long buried, not because of who I am, but because he didn't know who I was. Within 72 hours, the PDF had been downloaded over 4 million times. No ads, no paid promotion, it spread organically, from student emails to closed legal forums, then to public news feeds. quietly appearing on the corners of university library desks, printed without permission, passed hand to hand like living evidence of something that had never been formally taught, that the legal system isn't emotionless. It just chose not to listen. Students photocopied the printout into stacks across law school libraries nationwide. Senior professors canceled lectures to host discussions on it. And for the first time, junior faculty had to ask themselves, had they ever unknowingly taught something that made a student believe shooting a black woman could be a justifiable reaction? Department head who once defended the virtue of neutrality before the media went silent in a closed meeting when a third-year student raised the book and asked, "So what exactly are we teaching if what she wrote isn't in the curriculum?" But no one who reads it ever thinks the same way again. No one answered, because no one wanted to lie one more time to the very people learning to tell truth from fiction. And the consequence, then something else happened. At the annual conference of the National Prosecutors Council, once a regular stage for Jordan's former adversary to deliver yearly keynotes, the event was for the first time forced to halt mid-session as the massive screen behind the speaker suddenly displayed the cover of the book bearing its now familiar title. No one claimed responsibility, but an internal investigator later confirmed the projector had been tampered with from the inside. The irony? A man seated in the third row, once Jordan's direct supervisor, left the hall immediately after, and he never returned. The system wasn't just being challenged from the outside, it was beginning to leak from within by those who had once remained silent but could no longer bear the cost of complicity. Not long after, a clip circulated across all social platforms. Footage of the disgraced man, the same one who had signed off on dismissing every complaint tied to Jordan's case, stepping out of a news agency after requesting an opportunity to respond publicly. No stones were thrown, no curses were shouted, but two students stood quietly across the street, each holding up a plain white sign. The signs bore no words, only a red slash running vertically through a miniature copy of the internal memo he once used to absolve an officer who opened fire on civilians. He saw it and turned away. It wasn't humiliation, it was remembrance. Wordless, reasonless, but heavy enough to stop him from walking on as if untouched. In a constitutional law class in California, a professor asked students to identify examples of nonviolent civil responses capable of altering systemic behavior. Over 30 essays were submitted. 28 cited Jordan's book as their primary case. One student even included a note, "I won't speak of justice in front of my father. If he still believes you must wear a uniform to deserve to live." The note wasn't misplaced. The student's father was a former prosecutor, once close friends with the man now referenced only by sidelong glances. What was said in that family conversation is unknown, but the outcome was clear. The father withdrew from the state's review board the following week. A major television network once planned a live dialogue between Jordan and the man who had once denied her, to create, in their words, a moment of historic reconciliation. But the invitation was sent, not to Jordan, but to him, and he accepted. He arrived at the studio, sat in the makeup room, and prepared his opening statement in a tone he imagined would sound composed, remorseful. But 5 minutes before airtime, the studio lights went dark. A message appeared on screen. "The guest of honor has declined to attend. This program is not for reconciliation, it is for acknowledgement." The broadcast was canceled. His face, captured alone on a sofa in that dim waiting room, became the cover image of a piercing article titled, "When a Voice Loses Its Value Because It Once Screamed in Deceit." In the final pages of her book, Jordan listed no chapters, no appendices, no references. Only one closing line on its page, white text on a black background. "He didn't survive to be praised. I survived to remind you. If justice falls asleep, make it wake, with silence that cannot be ignored." No one commented, no edits were proposed, because nothing needed trimming or addition. It wasn't a farewell, it was the final bullet. No blood, no gun, but fired straight into the heart of a system that once mistook justice as a privilege not a duty. From then on, each time a student walked out of a lecture hall, they didn't just carry notes on criminal law or procedural rules. They carried something else, something unwritten, awareness, a warning, a reminder that if one day they stand before someone like Jordan, they must not ask, "Who are you?" but rather, "Who am I, if I don't dare stand with her?" Jordan never returned to the courtroom, but she still made the law bend, not through power, not through titles, but through existence, persistent, quiet, and undeniable. She never spoke at conferences, never argued in the media, never responded to mocking op-eds. Yet those who once uttered her name with disdain now only referred to her in the third person, as if she were some intangible force they couldn't bend, couldn't erase, and could no longer cleanse from public memory. Once, when a veteran professor at Yale Law attempted to reference the actions of a controversial former prosecutor, the class fell utterly silent. Not because they didn't know who he meant, but because no one would pretend such actions were controversial. In an academic world that once wrapped itself in subtlety, the name Jordan Arlen no longer invited debate. It had become a standard, quiet but sharp, forcing those who taught law to question whether they were educating for justice or enabling a system already off the rails. As for the disgraced man, the opposite held. He wasn't prosecuted, he wasn't stripped of his title, no one directly accused him, but the walls began to close in. Not by sentence, but by the rejection of the professional community he once represented. His name was struck from a peer review board after 7 formal petitions were submitted, each from a different law school, signed by students themselves. No one threatened, no one protested, but they submitted photocopies of the internal memo he once signed, with one question written plainly: "If you still believe this was right, would you dare read it aloud in this classroom?" Weeks later, at a legal symposium in Denver, where he had been a keynote speaker for 8 consecutive years, a message suddenly appeared on the main screen. "Due to program changes, Mr. B's presentation will not proceed as scheduled." No applause, but also no questions. Everyone knew the system no longer needed formal declarations to refuse someone who no longer held moral standing. It needed only silence, and this silence rang louder than any indictment. A month later, a professional law journal planned to publish an interview with him, an article framed to balance perspectives, but before it went to print, the editor received more than 90 emails from young attorneys, students, professors, and even a district judge, urging its retraction. No one demanded apologies. No one called it a boycott. But in one letter, a student simply wrote, "If you choose to publish this, please include an autopsy report, because this interview is living proof that the system once pretended its victims were the cause of the harm." The article was taken down. No press release, no apology, just a single link leading to a blank page with the words, "Content not found." And yet, it was shared millions of times as a symbolic act of resistance, a silent deletion, but one that shook the very moral foundation the system once believed unshakable. Another moment unfolded in New York, where a group of final-year law students organized a mock trial under the theme, "The Ethical Responsibility of Prosecutors." It was meant to be just an extended classroom session, but after it ended, the entire recording was edited into a short documentary, meticulously produced, citing more than 20 real cases. The clip gained over 10 million views in a single week. The most censure moment was a scene where a female student held up a copy of the letter rejecting an appeal, the one signed by him, and read it aloud in a strained, hoarse voice, stopping at the final line. There were no signs of irregularities during the investigation. She looked up, stared straight into the camera, and said, "No signs doesn't mean no truth." That moment was clipped, overlaid with the caption, "The truth doesn't need to be seen. It only needs to be remembered." And it became the symbol of the legal community's awakening movement. Jordan made no statement about any of it. She didn't comment, didn't share. But during a final lecture at Georgetown, when a student asked, "What do you think of those who used to laugh when you were brought down?" she answered with just one sentence, "Laughter is a defense mechanism, but some things once awakened, will never allow us to laugh again. Because in a world where every bullet carries a reason, the final bullet, the one never fired but which left a scar across an entire system, became a warning that cannot fade. Jordan's story is not just a case, a verdict, or a textbook lesson. It is a reminder that each of us lives within a system that needs to be re-examined. Not with momentary outrage, but with sustained awareness. Have you ever witnessed injustice? Stayed silent when something was wrong? Or had to endure moments that felt unbearable? Share your thoughts, your story, and your circumstances in the comments below. Every word you write is a way to remind someone suffering in silence that they are not alone. Click like to empower voices that have long been dismissed. Press share so that stories like this reach the people who need them most. Subscribe to this channel so I can keep writing, not just to tell stories, but to light up corners we thought were long forgotten. Every engagement you make is a declaration that justice, humanity, and courage are still alive, right here in this very community.